A young woman falls to her death from a rugged California cliff. Months after she's buried, an investigator suspects she was pushed. Researchers try to determine a woman's cause of death 3,000 years after she died. How can they perform an autopsy without destroying her fragile, mummified shell? To catch a murderer, detectives must prove that a few splinters of bone are the remains of a woman who disappeared 2 years earlier. Time doesn't heal all wounds, a fact that keeps relentless detectives on the trail of cold or forgotten cases. With cutting-edge technology, forensic experts are able to travel back in time, months, years, or millennia, to coax mysteries out of the grave. From San Diego to San Francisco, California's coastal highways are some of the most magnificent drives in the world. Heading north, stretches of glittering sand and crowded freeways gradually give way to a vastly different landscape. As Highway 1 winds through the Monterey Peninsula, mountains collide with the sea in a majestic alliance of power and beauty. In Big Sur, California, the huge sky and boundless Pacific Ocean seduce visitors to the edge of the dizzying cliffs for a breathtaking view of the edge of the world and a snapshot by which to remember it. But sometimes the pull is too strong. On April 2nd, 1987, the Monterey County Sheriff's Department received a phone call that something horrible had happened at the Seal Beach Overlook. The body of a 20-year-old woman named Dina Hubbard Wild was lying near the base of a 600-foot precipice. It was not the first time the search and rescue squad had been dispatched to collect the remains of a victim lured too close to the edge. A deputy from the sheriff's office questioned the middle-aged couple waiting at the scene. They were Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, tourists from San Diego. They told the officer that their young companion had tumbled over silently when they weren't looking. The rescue squad retrieved the lifeless body from the bottom of the cliff. After a cursory examination by the coroner, Dina Wild was returned to her hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, and buried. At the Second Presbyterian Church in Louisville, Dina Wild's freak accident was still on people's minds months after she'd been buried. When services ended one Sunday, Dina's mother, Bobby Roberts, approached a lawyer named Steve Keeney. She needed help collecting insurance money after her daughter's death.
She wanted to collect burial insurance that she had as part of her benefits as a teacher, and the insurance company had told her no. We told her that sometimes a letter from a law firm cuts through the red tape, we'd give it a try.
Keeney knew that Bobby could really use the $3,500. He agreed to make a few phone calls for her on his own time. Keeney called Bobby's insurance company and uncovered the source of the holdup. They had never received Dina's death certificate. Keeney then called the Monterey coroner's office requesting a copy of the death certificate. But when the document arrived, it listed the cause of death as pending. Because Dina's death was presumed to be an accident, the rescue team had done little beyond retrieving the body. No evidence was collected, no photographs were taken. The body was sent to the Monterey coroner's office. Its analysis found no hint of foul play. Bobby Roberts' simple request was snowballing into a time-consuming tangle of bureaucracy. But Keeney pressed on. He contacted Monterey law enforcement only to discover that the case was in limbo. The certificate couldn't be issued until cause of death was determined, but the sheriff's department had, for all intents and purposes, dropped the case for lack of evidence. Dina had been dead for months. What could be holding things up? Keeney called Bobby's insurance company again to see if there was some way of expediting Bobby's payment.
When we called back, we stumbled into a fact that we never expected. That was that there was life insurance on Dina in someone else's name, and they had made a claim for that policy.
The amount that you're looking for is $35,000?
That claimant was none other than Virginia McGinnis, the woman with whom Dina had spent her final hours. Just a day before Dina's death, Virginia had taken a $35,000 policy out on the young woman. The day after Dina's death, she had tried to cash in. In Keeney's mind, Dina's accidental tumble was swiftly transforming into something more sinister. But without a witness or a body, how could he distinguish between a tragic fall and a push?
Ask yourself, how do you prove someone was pushed off a cliff? Imagine you're standing at the edge of the cliff and you fall. Think of the injuries. You'll be battered, there'll be broken bones, there'll be bruises on your body will end up at the foot of the cliff. And now put yourself back at the cliff and imagine you're pushed. Same thing, right? Same bruises, same broken bones. Well, not quite.
The suspicion that Dina may have been shoved over the edge was a chilling hypothesis, but it was still just speculation. To prove any wrongdoing, Keeney needed evidence. He went back to basics, trying to learn more about Dina's relationship with the older couple. Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, the parents of one of Dina's friends, had taken her into their San Diego home after she was separated from her husband. Dina's loneliness was relieved in the fun-filled months she'd spent with her surrogate parents. She was known for her blind devotion to new friends. Had she been duped by the McGinnis's kindness? To check his suspicions, Keeney secured a copy of the autopsy report from the Monterey coroner's office. In the report, he noticed something unusual. A blood test revealed the presence of a drug called amitriptyline, commonly known as Elavil. The antidepressant had never been prescribed to Dina. It had, however, been prescribed to Virginia's husband, B.J. Toxicologist Catherine Ham retested a vial of Dina's blood that had been frozen after her autopsy. Her job was to check for levels of the drug. Keeney hoped that if a crime was committed, it could be proven in the lab.
I think that a lot of people that commit crimes underestimate what we can do in the laboratory.
To test for the presence of chemicals in the blood, Ham adds a solvent into the sample. The tube is rocked for 20 minutes as the drugs move out of the blood and into the solvent. The solvent is then removed from the tube and evaporated. The reconstituted solvent is injected into a gas chromatograph, an instrument that separates compounds according to their chemical properties. Ham compared the standard for the drug and the products of its breakdown with the chromatograph of Dina's blood. They matched. Having been frozen for so long, Dina's blood was degraded. Ham was unable to determine exactly when Dina had taken the drug, or exactly how much she'd taken. What she did know was that Dina Wild had Elavil in her system when she died. With its disorienting and unpleasant side effects, it was hardly the kind of medication that Dina might have popped for a quick buzz. People taking the drug are usually stricken with weakness, nausea, and dizziness. These symptoms would be more pronounced in individuals who, like Dina, didn't take the medication on a regular basis. As he learned about Elavil's effects, Keeney realized that he needed to revise his image of Dina's last moments of life. If she'd been as queasy and unsteady as Ham suggested, she most likely would have slid down the mountain, not plunged. Though no crime scene photos had been taken, the period of time before the fall was well documented. Virginia had sent Dina's mother the roll of snapshots from the day of the accident as a gesture of condolence. Could these posed snapshots tell Keeney about the cause of Dina's death? At first glance, the 15 chronological pictures told the story of an average sightseeing junket. Dina seemed comfortable and happy as she posed for the camera. But as Keeney studied the pictures more carefully, he suspected that he was witnessing a murder plot.
The photograph of Virginia and B.J. McGinnis walking away from the car was taken by Dina Wild, and it is a signature photo. It's at the cliff where she would die a few minutes later. It's when the Elavil has kicked in and she knows something's wrong. She's leaving a note to the rest of us that will survive her. It's like an assault victim who takes their own blood and writes the name of their assailant. She's pointing the finger.
The Elavil had clearly taken effect in the subsequent picture. Dina's bright eyes had grown dull. Her features slackened. She seemed unable to stand on her own.
That's great. 1, 2, 3.
When Keeney got to picture 11, the first thing that came to his mind was Dina knows. What at first seemed an innocuous cliffside stroll revealed upon closer examination the terrifying moment before Dina's death.
At that lip, you can see Dina's shoes pointing toward the boulders, in toward the road, but you can see her head in a blur, turning as she realizes her body is getting pushed that way. And as she looks, like you would if you were pushed, as she looks where she's going, the photo blurs. There are no features of her face at all. But her shoes still point to BJ, the guy she trusted.
Moments later, she would be dead. To Keeney's way of thinking, the bizarre and disturbing circumstances of Dina's death were leading to a single conclusion.
Once you know a 20-year-old dies with 55-year-old strangers at her side, and you know that those strangers bought a life insurance policy on her, in your heart, don't you believe that that's almost bound to be a murder?
Armed only with a handful of photos and a hunch, Keeney was a long way from proving murder. He knew he would need some help. In Louisville, Kentucky, Steve Keeney revisited Dina Wild's autopsy report, looking for a shred of evidence to support his murder hypothesis. The Monterey coroner had determined the cause of Dina's death to be a skull fracture. He surmised that she lost her footing because of her high-heeled shoes. In his opinion, there was nothing suspicious about the circumstances of the so-called accident. Keeney wasn't so sure. He wondered if there was anything in the coroner's slim findings that suggested otherwise. Keeney brought the autopsy photos to forensic pathologist Barbara Weekly-Jones. Could her analysis of the pictures differentiate a murder from an accident?
Steve Keeney was surprised when I told him some of the injuries were suggestive of not just an accidental death. Describe any on one hand.
The only fatal injury on Dina's body was a blow to the head, yet the right side of her body had linear scrape marks. To Weekly-Jones, those lacerations suggested a limp slide, not a head-first plummet. Dina's bruised hands provided the most telling physical evidence. They hadn't sustained the kinds of injury typical in a fall. Her acrylic nails were snapped off, ragged, and embedded with granite, suggesting she'd clawed at the edge of the cliff, trying to save her life. Or perhaps she'd fought before she plunged to her death. In addition to the torn nails, both hands were marred by a very suspicious wound pattern.
But they had huge hematomas, black and blues, on the tops around her knuckles. Those you get when somebody steps on your hand, if you're holding the edge of a cliff.
Keeney wondered if Dina's broken skull was the result or the cause of her terrible fall. The top of the cliff sloped gently for the first few yards. If Dina had been trying to save herself, she no doubt would have grabbed at a rock or a tree root. But her palms showed no injuries, no signs of clutching at anything.
And look, she had fingernails. It looks like artificial fingernails.
Weekly-Jones's findings substantiated Keeney's theory of an intentional push and a limp slide.
But that's not proof of homicide. So what else do you do? Well, the old phrase is, circumstances don't lie, people do.
There you go.
Keeney needed to take a close look at the suspects, Virginia and B.J. McGinnis.
Yeah. Well, they come up
Had
and
this
down
pleasant,
from
middle-aged
Mexico,
couple
from
really
October
plotted to
to
do away with Dina?
February.
Were they truly capable of pushing their young friend off a 600-foot cliff?
Yeah, they spawn. That's what they do. That's
As he
a good
probed
word
the
for it.
backgrounds of his prime suspects, Keeney uncovered a trail of death and deception. Virginia's rap sheet was a lot bloodier than Keeney had anticipated. Though the former nurse could affect a saccharine persona, her past suggested a cold, psychopathic profile that included compulsive lying, arson, and cruelty to animals. In addition to the accidental deaths of her daughter and second husband, Virginia's parents and several of her patients had died of unknown causes while in her charge. She frequently benefited from their life insurance policies. Keeney compiled this information into a lengthy report. It wasn't enough evidence to arrest Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, but it was enough to get the case reopened in California. Because the McGinnises had purchased Dina's insurance policy in San Diego, the district attorney's office in that jurisdiction became involved. Investigator Scott Lawrence took the baton from Steve Keeney. Like the Louisville attorney, he was compelled to make sense of Dina's fall. But Dina's case didn't have the benefit of much physical evidence. Lawrence attempted to disprove the theory of an accidental tumble by recreating Dina's trajectory. It was more than a year and a half after Dina's death, so any blood or geographic disturbance from her fall would have been washed away. The only thing Lawrence knew for sure was where she landed. What he needed to determine was where the fall started.
Well, one of the things that we had to look into was where we knew she was last standing at this turnout, almost within a few feet of where I'm at. That's based upon testimonial evidence as well as photographic.
Based on Lawrence's assessment, this wasn't a place where a person was likely to lose her footing, even in high-heeled shoes. The ground was relatively flat and solid. Now, Lawrence could recreate Dina's path down the cliff. Though he was a novice rock climber, his fierce commitment to the truth compelled him down the cliff face with a video camera in hand. From his topographic analysis, Lawrence believed that Dina was dead or near death when she lost her grip on the edge of the overlook. For one thing, the first section of the cliffside was not a sheer drop. Had Dina accidentally fallen here, she probably would have been able to stop her descent. She probably would have screamed. After the initial slope, the cliff drops off suddenly. Lawrence experimented to see how fast and by which route Dina was likely to have descended.
So we could take individual rocks and toss them down, and you get a pretty good idea of how you would accelerate once you got past the incline and once you made that first precipice about 40 or 50 feet down to my right, down toward the ocean.
Had Dina free-fallen off the precipice, she would have hit the bottom in excess of 120 miles per hour. Yet her body was in one piece, with no tumbling marks and relatively few fractures. Lawrence's research corroborated Weekly Jones's analysis of the body. Dina went down the cliff in a slow, limp slide, not an accelerating, high-speed tumble. Lawrence's careful recreation of the fall didn't jibe with the story relayed by the McGinnises.
So we tried many ways to interpret what could have happened, and the bottom line is there's always unknowns, and the people that know aren't talking.
By September of 1989, police gathered enough incriminating evidence to arrest the McGinnises. For the trial, the cliffside overlook was transformed into an outdoor courtroom. Scott Lawrence's careful recreation had a profound impact on the jury. The odyssey begun in Steve Keeney's office ended when the jury found Virginia McGinnis guilty of conspiracy, first-degree murder, insurance fraud, forgery, and murder for financial gain. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. B.J. McGinnis had died of pneumonia before the trial began. The inconsistencies in the so-called accidental death of Dina Hubbard Wild had been untangled to reveal a cold-blooded murder, despite the fact that neither the body nor the crime scene had been preserved. For experts hoping to solve old murders, keen analysis of the meager traces left behind means the difference between overdue justice and a death that is forever lost in time. For 7 years, Susan Davis endured an unsatisfying marriage with a struggling insurance salesman named Ralph. Leaving was always on her mind, but she never got very far from their Columbia, Missouri home. Then, one evening in June 1985, after a long day at her secretarial job, she climbed into her Ford Escort and drove off, never to be seen again. When she failed to show up for work the next day or answer phone calls, her mother contacted the police. Officers from the Boone County Police Department questioned relatives and searched the Davis home, but found nothing to indicate that Susan had been taken against her will.
Yes, I'm so worried.
Some people believed Susan's departure was her way of making a clean break from a life that had gotten too painful and messy. At the time of her disappearance, Susan had finally succeeded in making some big changes. She'd separated from Ralph and sent her 2 children, Robbie and Angela, to live with her parents in Iowa.
And what was his occupation?
Perhaps she was starting her life over in some other part of the country. Captain Larry McCrae led the investigation.
Ralph Davis told us that when Susan disappeared that she had a boyfriend and she'd probably gone off to Texas and someday she'd show back up.
Susan was officially declared a missing person. In her absence, Ralph moved back into the house, brought his children home from their grandparents, and settled into the life of a single father. The family waited in vain for Susan's return. As his finances dwindled, Ralph went to court to make sure that if Susan did resurface, she'd be compelled to pay him child support. But there were still no clues as to her whereabouts and diminishing hope that she'd ever return. But as McCrae came to realize, Ralph Davis's victimized spouse routine was a feeble charade. The more he probed police files, the more McCrae came to realize what an abusive husband Ralph had been. For the duration of their marriage, Susan had lived in the wake of Ralph's ferocity. Then, one night in 1985, a few months before her disappearance, she'd reached the breaking point. Fearing for her life and the safety of her children, she garnered the strength to call the police. Ralph was arrested.
We investigated a case where Ralph had beat her up. We'd photographed, and at that time, there was an ex parte on her, which says, Ralph, you cannot go back to your home. You have to stay away from Susan and the kids.
A short stay in jail did little to calm Ralph. He had been boiling mad when he was released on bail. Then Susan disappeared. Ralph's violent tendencies gave credence to the theory that Susan had left him and covered her trail to ensure her safety. But for McCrae, the pieces still weren't adding up. Why hadn't this devoted mother contacted her children? Why hadn't she checked in with her frantic mother to let her know that she was all right? McCrae suspected he was looking at something more ominous than a woman in search of a happier life. McCrae believed that Ralph Davis wasn't telling the whole story. But without any evidence, the police had no course of action. There was no body. There were no leads. Even Susan's car had disappeared. McCrae's only option was to dig in and hope that one day a clue would surface. He didn't imagine that the waiting game would play out for so long. It had been 2 years since Susan Davis climbed into her car and vanished. Whether she left town intentionally or met a horrible fate remained an unanswered question. Captain McCrae's investigation met a dead end. Then one day, the owner of a storage facility took the locks off a unit rented by a customer who'd stopped paying his bills. Inside was a Ford Escort with the driver's side window blown in. The name of the delinquent customer was none other than Ralph Davis.
That's McCrae.
Captain McCrae was contacted. A quick run of the vehicle ID and tags confirmed it was Davis's car. McCrae took a look inside and was struck with a terrible sight.
When we approach the car and we look inside of it, we're pretty sure that somebody died in that car.
Blood and tissue spattered the dashboard, seats, and visors. Glass shards mingled with spent bullet shells on the car floor. 2 feeble air fresheners added a grim irony to the grisly scene. After 2 years of sitting on his hands, McCrae could finally move in on his prime suspect, Ralph Davis. Davis came up with a story to explain away the car. Before blowing out of town, he said, Susan had paid him one last visit. She was armed. Ralph overpowered her, pulled her out of the car, and climbed behind the wheel. As he drove away, he claimed, Susan smashed the window with her arm, bloodying the glass. The implausible account did little to explain how bits of body tissue got into the car. Davis was arrested. Experience told McCrae that he'd just detained a brutal murderer, but proving that in court would be another matter, especially when the crime scene was 2 years old. A successful forensic investigation would take a two-pronged approach. First, McCrae's team would have to establish that a murder had in fact taken place in the car, and secondly, they'd have to identify the victim. McCrae believed he was looking at the remains of Susan Davis, but he was a long way from proving it. From the pattern of blood in the car, preliminary crime scene reconstruction determined that the victim had been shot inside the vehicle.
On the floor of the car, we found glass, basically moving inward, which would indicate that a shot or something had gone through that and from the outside. As we looked at the glass, we found that the glass was on the floorboard, and on top of the glass was blood.
It seemed that the shot came through the window, striking the driver in the head. The force sent the victim toward the other side of the car, crashing first into the rearview mirror hard enough to crack the windshield. From the amount of blood and brain tissue found in the car, the medical examiner determined that someone had died here. The automobile was towed to a private storage lot where McCrae's team could try to make sense of the disarray. Because they didn't know what was evidence, they erred on the side of caution and collected everything.
Do you see, is there something back over, see back over?
Armed with specialized tools, apparel, and collection bottles, the investigators began to take the car apart, piece by piece, carefully cataloging each fragment of bone, tissue, and each smear of blood. Bullets were dislodged from the interior of the car. They matched shotgun shells found in Ralph Davis's home. A vacuum with sterile filters was used to collect the tiniest pieces of evidence. Like high-tech car vandals, the team stripped the Escort down to the bare bones, bagging everything from the steering wheel to the carpeting for further analysis. At the University of Missouri's Human Skeletal ID Lab, bits of debris, some metal, some glass, some unidentified, were delivered in a matchbox to anthropologist Sam Stout. If human bone fragments were present in the jumbled findings, Stout would know how to unlock their secrets.
My work as an anthropologist was probably important in this case because as anthropologists we're often called upon to analyze bone specimens. We're probably the most familiar with pieces of bone, fragments of bone, whether it be a 2 million year old fossil to a modern cemetery.
33 fragments, none longer than a quarter inch, were separated into little plastic caps.
Bone specimens to embed in plastic, and then we'll...
Because the findings were so small, it was nearly impossible to determine by sight whether they were bone. To be sure, Stout needed to examine the samples under a microscope. First, they needed to be prepared for viewing. To make slides, Stout's assistant embeds each fragment in plastic. As the air in the vacuum chamber is drawn away, the plastic impregnates the sample, then hardens. The embedded specimen is cut into slices as thin as cellophane. Each slice is then smoothed and placed on a glass slide for viewing. Microscopic analysis of the cross-sections told Stout that he was in fact looking at human bone. Stout knew where the fragments came from, a human skull. Dr. Stout had determined that the meager scrapings from the floor of Susan Davis's car were in fact human facial bones. Now he wanted to see if there was anything unique about the bone fragments that could tie them to Susan Davis and her death. Stout noticed that there were some smudges on the bone fragments. He sent them to the geology department at the University of Missouri lab. A scanning electron microscope revealed that traces of lead had been embedded in the bone. The presence of antimony indicated that gunpowder was involved as well. This victim had been shot. The close scrutiny of these fragments was turning the cloudy details into a vivid portrait of murder. But how could Stout link the bone to Susan Davis? Stout noticed an odd characteristic. Beyond the lead smudges was another lighter discoloration in the bone. In Stout's experience, that pattern indicated that the victim had been taking tetracycline. To test for the antibiotic, he exposed the bone to fluorescent light. If the drug were present, the bone would glow.
We saw the actual fluorescing of tetracycline, and upon seeing that, I suggested that they examine the records to see if Susan Davis had a prescription for tetracycline.
Dr. Stout estimated that the victim had been taking the drug for at least 3 months before death. McCrae knew from the original search of Susan's home that she'd been prescribed tetracycline at the time of her death. Stout had shown that the remains in the car were from the face of a person who was taking tetracycline. But McCrae needed irrefutable proof that this was Susan Davis. Without it, Ralph Davis would likely go free.
The missing link was, whose body was it? We all felt that it was Susan, but that's not evidence that you can take to court.
No murderer in the state of Missouri had ever been convicted without a body, so McCrae had a double burden. Before he could prove that Ralph Davis was a killer, he'd have to prove that Susan Davis was the victim. The finishing touches of the investigation would have to be drawn in blood. Could bloodstains link a 2-year-old crime scene to the death of Susan Davis? It was forensic serologist Lori Maloney's job to find out. Carpeting, sun visors, and upholstery from the interior of the car were sent to her at the Missouri State Highway Patrol lab. If she could determine that blood on these items came from Susan Davis, it would be nearly impossible for Ralph Davis to evade prosecution. But, as Maloney knew, irrefutable victim identification is tricky business. She needed to run a series of tests to find out exactly whose blood this was. Above all, she needed to be precise to check and cross-check her results. Maloney's first task was to swab the samples to make sure that the stains found in the car were truly blood. The test turns green when blood is present. Maloney then needed to confirm that the blood was human. She added human antibody to the samples. When human blood and human antibody come in contact, they react, forming a thin white line. Maloney's results were consistent with McCrae's theory that someone had been killed in the vehicle.
I found on the evidence human blood detected on the carpeting and the seat belt latches. Also, I found human protein on the sun visors.
But how could she prove that the remains had come from Susan Davis? She had no samples of Susan's blood or tissue to compare them with. Paternity tests are commonly used to establish a man's parenthood by comparing his DNA with that of the child and its mother. By applying that standard procedure in a creative new way, a reverse paternity test, Maloney hoped to simulate Susan Davis's genetic profile. Every child gets half his DNA from his mother, half from his father. Subtracting DNA bands that the father and child have in common leaves a barcode representing the mother's genetic signature.
The remaining bands would then be used to compare to the crime scene evidence, and if those were matching to the crime scene evidence, the blood could have originated from the mother, Susan Davis.
Using this procedure, Ralph Davis's DNA pattern was subtracted from his children's. The resulting bands were a close simulation of Susan Davis's genetic fingerprint. This banding pattern matched the samples found on the Ford Escort's carpet. Susan Davis had been killed in her car. The ghostly fingerprint of a woman who'd vanished years earlier was returning to solve her murder.
What I think happened to Susan Davis was that she was going to leave this area to some safe haven because of Ralph's harassing her, stalking, and she was packing her car, backed up to the front of the house, loading her clothes in it when Ralph came around the house. She saw Ralph, got in the car, locked it up, and Ralph came up and shot her through the driver's side window.
Thanks to astute forensic analysis and an exacting recreation of the grisly death scene, prosecutors convinced the jury that Ralph Davis had killed his estranged wife in her car. It was a landmark decision in Missouri, one that saw Ralph Davis get the death penalty, even though the whereabouts of his victim is a mystery to this day. In the Susan Davis case, investigators had to revisit a crime that happened 2 years earlier without the benefit of a body. In Canada, investigators faced a similar but even stranger challenge: to determine what killed a woman 3,000 years ago. They had the body, but to touch it would be to destroy it. At the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, a mummy named Jedame-Sank, or Jed, has stood in silent vigil for decades. Her secrets wrapped tightly inside her delicate sarcophagus. Museum visitors and scientists alike are fascinated by her mysterious beauty and eager to know more about how she lived and died. From the elaborate drawings on her cartonnage, the shell of linen and glue in which her mummy is encased, we know only scattered details of her life. Nearly 3,000 years ago, Jed, a musician at the Temple Amun-Re, lived a prosperous life on the east bank of the Nile.
So that she will not want.
Ancient Egyptians celebrated life after death, but it could only be attained if they departed this world in the prescribed fashion. The journey to the land of the gods would be strenuous and dangerous. In order for the soul to survive the trip, the body needed to be strong. Mummification was the answer. A marriage of science and religion, the mummification process followed a strictly detailed procedure that took approximately 10 weeks to complete. After death, the body was cleansed and anointed. A single slit was made in the abdomen. Then the internal organs were removed and preserved in jars. Natron, a powdery drying agent made up of salt and sand, was heaped over the body. In the arid heat of the Egyptian sun, the body would completely desiccate in 40 days. The skin was rubbed with oils and resin to keep it supple. Linen stuffing was inserted in the body cavities to maintain lifelike contours. The corpse was adorned with makeup and funerary jewelry. Then the arduous task of wrapping began. In an effort to know more about these ancient people, many researchers, like pediatrician Peter Lewin, have found themselves compelled to unwrap the mysterious packages.
In the olden days, we would break up this casket, tear off the bandages of the individual inside who's mummified, break up the tissues to examine genetic material, chemistry, and any diseases, and in essence destroy a mummy, which is invaluable to humanity.
Lewin grew up in Egypt and has maintained a lifelong fascination with mummies. Today, in addition to his work at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, he is a leading researcher in the field of paleopathology.
Paleopathology is really the study of diseases of ancient man, and that can be done by examining the bodies themselves, and also can be done by the latest use of X-ray technology.
How could Dr. Lewin see into the life of this mummy and learn why she died without desecrating the sanctity of her death? X-ray technology, known as computerized axial tomography, or CT scanning, was the answer to Lewin's dilemma. The machine produces cross-sectional images of the body without touching it. When the slices are stacked together, a three-dimensional image is rendered. Dr. Lewin was assisted by CT technician Stephanie Holoka. Lewin, who pioneered the use of the technique to slice into mummies without using a knife, first scanned Jed in 1978. But the technology was in its infancy, and he was barely able to distinguish the ancient body from the dense packing material. Nearly 20 years later, he was ready to try again. Because the patient was already dead, Holoka didn't need to worry about radiation levels. That freedom enabled her to take numerous pictures at very small increments. She scanned the body in 5mm slices and went to 3mm increments for the head and neck. Even greater detail was used to image the ears and eyes. 300 two-dimensional images were taken during the 4 hours of scanning. Glimpses of Jed came through in these X-rays, but it wouldn't be until they were stacked together that the ancient woman would truly come to life. Once the meticulous scanning was completed, it was finally time for the mummy to show herself. A computer compiled the pictures into a 3D rendering, but the quality was poor. In living patients, bone is dense and shows up white. Fat, flesh, and skin are gray. Liquid is black. In Jed's body, the bones had lost minerals and become softer, while the soft tissue had toughened. Instead of a high-contrast image, Jed was showing up only in shades of gray. This low-contrast problem meant that Holoka would have to painstakingly render the images slice by slice. Imaging the skull in a live patient takes 10 minutes. It took Holoka 3 hours to reconstruct Jed's skull and hundreds of hours to render the entire body. Holoka was then able to electronically peel away the layers. After removing the outermost layer of cartilage, she arrived at the linen wrapping that surrounded the head. Gray circles showed up over the eye sockets. The Egyptians inserted plates behind the lids to keep the features from sinking. Holoka also noticed that in keeping with the ritual, Jed's brain had been removed and her skull stuffed with linen. Finally, the image of a small, young woman appeared. Based on the pattern of bone fusion, Jed was estimated to be 30 to 35 years old when she died.
And the first thing I thought when I saw her skull, after doing a lot of 3D imaging on various skulls, is that she must have been a very pretty lady. She had very high cheekbones and she had a very well-defined chin.
Holoka had used CT technology to excavate the mummy. Now, Lewin wanted to know what killed her. Could he determine cause of death 3,000 years after the fact? Lewin examined the 3D image of Jed's skull. He noticed a strange black shape on the left jawbone. The gaping hole, he realized, was an enormous abscess. Hard as it is to believe, Jed had died from dental disease. Ancient Egyptians were prone to dental disease because of their sandy, coarse diet and their love for sweets. In Jed's case, the outer enamel on 24 of her 28 teeth had worn away, exposing the sensitive dental pulp and the root. Exposed roots are acutely painful. They also become infected easily. Jed's infection was spread from the root canal to the bone, where it caused several abscesses. Lewin surmised that the large pus-filled cyst probably burst, spreading infection throughout her body and poisoning her blood. It was probably an agonizingly painful, drawn-out death.
She probably died a very, very miserable death due to genital infection, which originated from this basically dental abscess of her left upper jaw.
In life, this beautiful musician from Thebes endured agonizing pain. In death, thanks to the pioneering efforts of Dr. Lewin's team, she has finally achieved the kind of celebrated and dignified afterlife her culture held so dearly.
With this type of imaging, really, we have pioneered the use of that sort of technology which is non-destructive and which gives us tremendous information in relation to diseases of ancient man.
Because Jeramesank had been so carefully preserved, time didn't stand in the way of science. Detectives who lure truth from the murky past are constantly fighting against the ravages of time. Today, science is their greatest ally in that battle. Armed with the latest techniques, forensics experts are winning the war against time, liberating lost and forgotten voices from beyond the grave. Tourist town becomes a death trap for 3 vacationing women. Investigators must link the suspect to the crime scene, or their case will be dead in the water. During her abduction, a woman is shot on videotape. Can the blurry image help detectives zoom in on her killer? A murder case rests on 2 computer disks that have been cut to ribbons. Now, investigators must invent a way to assemble their evidence bit by bit. Every phone call can be followed. Every transaction leaves a trace. Most of us never give it a second thought. But when a crime occurs, technology becomes an electronic witness. On June 4th, 1989, investigators in Tampa, Florida found themselves plunged into the depths of a mystery. At 9:30 in the morning, boaters discovered a body floating in Tampa Bay. Its hands were tied behind its back. Duct tape covered the nose and mouth. The victim was naked from the waist down. The Coast Guard arrived to recover the body. They cut it free of a weight that dangled below the surface. The victim was female. As they carried her to shore, another call came in. A second body had surfaced 7 miles away. Like the first, she was bound and apparently raped. She was also thrown in alive. It was clearly a victim of the same killer. St. Petersburg detective Cindra Cummings worked the case.
This body, the second one, also had a yellow nylon rope tied around her neck. It was another female, nude from the waist down. The end of the rope around her neck was tied to a 2-cell cement block. Her feet were tied together. Her hands were tied at one point, but we believe she struggled and she was able to get her hands free in the water before she died.
The killer hadn't finished. No sooner had the second body been recovered than a third victim surfaced 200 yards away, killed in the same manner. The triple homicide in the water sent out ripples of activity. Police boats scoured Tampa Bay for more victims. Divers descended to the bottom. But no more bodies were found. That was the good news. The bad news was that the killer left no immediate clues. He was still out there, somewhere.
Whoever killed these women had to be some kind of a monster.
The autopsy revealed the 3 women had been dead between 2 and 3 days, giving their killer ample time to flee. Each died from lack of oxygen, either from the tape across their noses and mouths, the rope around their necks, or by drowning. The horror of the crime was compounded by the anonymity of the victims. In a tourist spot like Tampa, people come and go every day. The victims could have come from anywhere. The case was heavily publicized, hoping that someone who knew the victims would come forward. Hundreds of leads poured in. 60 detectives were assigned to follow up. Not one lead panned out. Meanwhile, 1,100 miles away in Van Wert County, Ohio, a dairy farmer named Hal Rogers grew anxious. His wife, Jo, and daughters Michelle and Christy were vacationing in Florida.
But I wish Dad could come. Why can't he?
It was their first time off the farm.
You know someone's got to stay on
The girls had never been to the ocean before and were very excited. But Hal couldn't escape his obligations at the farm and had to send his family without him. Their last postcard was dated 11 days earlier, and they hadn't called in a week. He knew something was wrong. While Hal Rogers contemplated a trip to Florida to look for his family, a maid at a Tampa hotel had suspicions of her own. For 7 days, she returned to the same room to clean it, but found that the occupants hadn't slept in the beds or even opened a bar of soap.
I never saw anybody.
Nobody at all.
The publicity surrounding the murdered women was fresh in her mind. Wondering if there were a connection, she told her manager about the room. He notified the police. The room was registered to Jo Rogers. She had arrived with 2 children. forensics dusted for fingerprints. One set was positively identified as one of the murder victims. Identification was difficult because the bodies were so decomposed when found. But investigators at last had something to work with. On the hotel registration, Rogers had listed her vehicle. The car wasn't in the parking lot. Tampa police spread out to locate it. They found it parked at a boat ramp 2.5 miles from the hotel. Forensics combed every inch of it for clues. They found a tourist brochure. On the back were handwritten directions to their hotel. The penmanship was compared against Joe's, Christie's, and Michelle's. It didn't match. It was apparently written by someone they met on the road. To investigators, this meant only that they became lost and asked someone for directions. It was hardly a lead. A tourist's life is full of such brief interactions with strangers. That's precisely why investigators were so troubled by this case. The killer, too, was no doubt a stranger to the victims, and crimes committed by strangers are the hardest to solve because nothing connects victim to killer.
It could be anyone from the entire Tampa Bay population that we were concerned about. And it had everyone in Tampa Bay area concerned and worried because the victims were just tourists, someone that everyone can identify with. They weren't in a drug area, they weren't doing anything illegal or anything wrong, and here they were singled out and victimized by an unknown person. And we had no leads to the suspect, nothing to start with.
Investigators also found a sheet of hotel stationery with directions to the boat ramp. They included the words blue with white. Because the directions were to the boat ramp and the women were killed on the water, detectives assumed the words described the killer's boat. It also described hundreds of other boats in Tampa Bay. Investigators determined that the handwriting on the stationery matched Joe Rogers. The killer must have visited or phoned her at the hotel and dictated them. But no one had seen him, and the hotel didn't keep a log of incoming calls. The ferocity of the crime told police that the killer probably had a prior record. More than likely, he worked his way up to murder through a series of smaller crimes. But without further leads, the investigation stagnated. Months rolled by as waves of suspects arose and were eliminated. In October, 4 months after the murders, investigators received a bulletin about a rape that occurred on a boat at Madeira Beach 2 weeks before the Rogers were killed. The victim was a tourist. Madeira Beach was only 10 miles from the murder scene. Sergeant Glenn Moore says the similarities between this case and the Rogers rape and murder didn't stop there.
The suspect in the Madeira Beach case had threatened to use duct tape on the mouth of one of the victim on the Madeira Beach rape case, and that was what was used on our victims. He also threatened this woman with dying. Was it worth dying for? And he also had a blue and white boat.
The victim gave police a description of the rapist.
His eyes were sunken, very sunken.
Besides his blue and white boat, she also remembered that her attacker drove a dark four-wheel drive vehicle with tinted windows. A composite of her attacker's face was published in the papers. Tips flooded in. Months passed as detectives chased every lead that could connect a suspicious stranger to the victims. It came to nothing. By now, almost a year had passed, and and all they had was a picture of a rapist who may or may not be the killer. Without any promising leads in the Tampa Bay triple homicide, Sergeant Glenn Moore reviewed the evidence collected so far. He had a composite sketch with no ID and a brochure with directions to the hotel written in a stranger's hand. The brochure was taken to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement lab in Tampa and processed to reveal fingerprints. It held some prints that didn't belong to any of the victims. They were analyzed by latent print examiner Sam McMullen.
There's what we call, or refer to sometimes as writer's palm, and that's when you're writing a document the way that your hand, the palm of your hand, falls on the document itself.
A palm print is just as conclusive as a fingerprint in making an ID. Whoever left these prints wrote the directions on the brochure. Now, detectives wondered if this same person possibly killed the Rogers. If this writer were the killer, his fingerprints were probably on file for prior offenses. Although palm prints become part of a repeat offender's record, they aren't usually cataloged in the computerized fingerprint system. Investigators had no way of doing an automated search. All they could do was manually compare the print against each new suspect that surfaced. More time slipped by without a match. The prints and the writing sample seemed useless. Moore wouldn't let the investigation die. The man who killed the Rogers was at large, and police were determined to find him. To flush him out, they held press conferences, posted billboards.
And typically what happens is you put up a picture of the victims and you say, does anybody know anything about this case? I think what was a little bit different and unique about what we did with the billboards is we actually put a picture of the handwriting evidence up on the billboard and asked people to look at that and tell us if they knew who the handwriter was.
Among the deluge of leads, one stood out. A woman named Joanne Steffi told police that the handwriting looked like a former neighbor's, an aluminum siding contractor named Oba Chandler. She had seen the composite when it first appeared and thought it resembled Chandler. But she wasn't sure. The handwriting rekindled her suspicions.
When we put the handwriting up on the billboards and it brought it back to her attention, she went and checked with some other neighbors and some other people and found some contracts for the business he was in. She made the visual comparison herself along with her neighbors, and they decided it was a great likelihood this was the writer, so they gave us a call.
The contracts and brochure were sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, where they were scrutinized by document examiner Teresa Stubbs.
The examination of handwriting is really a study of movement. You're looking at all the aspects of the writing, the beginning strokes, the ending strokes, the height relationships of letters to other letters. Once I had familiarized myself with all those habits that were on the brochure, then I compared them with the habits found in the known sample of writing submitted as being that of Mr. Chandler. I found that they were significantly similar in all aspects with no differences.
The handwriting match was the break the detectives needed. A little more digging, and investigators found that 45-year-old Oba Chandler had a long criminal record, having been charged with everything from burglary and counterfeiting to kidnapping. Police obtained his palm prints from his prison records. The print found on the brochure matched Oba Chandler's right hand. They had their suspect. Now they had to build their case.
And how are you?
Detectives arranged a photo lineup with the Madeira Beach rape victim, asking if she could identify the man who attacked her.
In these particular photographs.
She selected Oba Chandler's picture. More confident than ever that Chandler was the murderer, Sergeant Moore kept him under surveillance to see if he would tip his hand. He didn't. And they didn't have enough to arrest him. To prove he killed the Rogers, they had to place him at the scene of the crime. The waters of Tampa Bay held no clues, but maybe the answer was in the air. Detectives sought his phone records to see if they could trace his whereabouts. Chandler's phone records showed that on the night of the murders, June 1st, 1989, 5 calls were made between 1:30 and 5 a.m. The prefixes showed that these calls were shipped to shore, made collect to his home.
They were extremely important. They put Oba Chandler on his boat the night of the killings, the night that the women were murdered and thrown into the bay. We could prove that Oba Chandler was on his boat.
At his trial, Chandler said he'd been fishing on the bay that night when his engine failed. He told the jury that his fuel line broke, and by the time he fixed it with duct tape, he'd lost all his gas. He was stranded until a passing boat rescued him the next morning. But the jury didn't buy his fish story. On cross-examination, Chandler couldn't explain why he called home but didn't call a towing service. He couldn't describe where the fuel line enters the engine. He didn't realize that duct tape doesn't stick to a gas-covered fuel line. And most importantly, he didn't know his engine had an anti-siphon valve, making it impossible for the gas to leak out if the line burst.
I believe that was one of the defining moments for the jury, to see him on the stand and to see all of what he said proven wrong.
The prosecution presented a more credible scenario.
Excuse me, sir. Do you know how to get to the Viking Hotel?
Yeah, which one?
Lost in Tampa, Jo Rogers and her daughters stopped to ask directions to their hotel. The friendly stranger who showed them the way was Oba Chandler. Now he knew where they were staying. He may have called them shortly after they checked in, inviting them to watch the setting sun from aboard his boat. Jo jotted down the directions, and off they went. There was no time to unpack. When they arrived at the pier, Chandler was there to greet them. They boarded the boat, never suspecting this was to be their last sunset. For his crimes, Oba Chandler was sentenced to death. Oba Chandler didn't care who he killed. Most murderers are more selective. The road to their conviction begins with a motive. In Northumberland County in central Pennsylvania, a young girl returned home from her grandparents' house. She'd walked this path dozens of times, and her mind was 1,000,000 miles away. But on June 12, 1989, the foul smell of decay caught her attention. She cautiously investigated, hoping it wasn't a dog struck by a car. What she found was far worse, a human body.
How long ago?
Pennsylvania State Police rushed in to document the scene before the body was transported to the morgue for autopsy. Every homicide investigation begins with 3 questions. Who's the victim? When did the murder take place? And who did it? District Attorney Robert Sakavage, now a district judge, searched for answers.
We could not get a quick identification. We had to use scientific techniques. We had to get a forensic odontologist to examine the teeth and so forth for that purpose. Also, we were interested in finding what the time of death was.
The warm weather had taken its toll. There wasn't much left to collect. All that the police could tell was that the victim was female. She didn't easily surrender information about her death. Her clothing provided the first clue. County Coroner Richard Ulrich analyzed the remains.
The clothing was removed, and upon being removed was displayed and was examined further, and at this point in time it was felt that she suffered repeated stab wounds to the back through the clothing, which indicated blunt force sharp injury.
Next, the insect life colonizing the body was examined. The life cycles of flies and beetles can be used to estimate the time of death. The longer a body sits, the more generations of insects it nourishes. It was determined that the victim was killed between 19 and 25 days earlier. The dental records identified the victim as Lori Ocker, who had disappeared 19 days before, on May 24th. Lori Ocker and her son had moved back in with her parents after separating from her husband.
You know,
She was last seen leaving home at 3:30 for her job at a pet store in the mall. By 4 o'clock, she hadn't arrived at work. Her boss phoned her home to see where she was.
She left for work
Her mother was
a
concerned.
half hour ago.
She should have been there already. Thinking her car may have broken down, her parents retraced her route. They saw no sign of her until they arrived at the mall. Her car was parked near the entrance, but no trace of Lori was found until her body was recovered 19 days later. For almost 3 weeks, Lori Ocker was considered a missing person. But now her case was turned over to homicide, and attention shifted to finding her killer. Lori's mother told police that Lori had received threats from her estranged husband, Robert Ocker. The couple had been battling over custody of their son. Lori had been so afraid of Robert that she kept a shotgun under her bed for protection. He became the prime suspect. Shortly after Lori disappeared, police had questioned Robert Ocker. He told investigators that he'd been out running errands in his Plymouth Caravelle. He hadn't seen Lori. His parents, questioned later, agreed that he'd been out, but said he'd driven his mother's car, a 1984 Chevy Celebrity. At the time, the inconsistency meant nothing to investigators. Robert may have been lying because he wasn't covered on the Chevy's insurance. To prove Robert's involvement, they'd have to place him at the scene of the abduction. Police went to the mall to see if anyone had seen anything suspicious. They spoke to a teller at the bank next to the mall entrance. She suggested that perhaps the tape from the automatic teller machine held some clue, since it captured the portion of the parking lot where the victim parked her car.
Well, I don't remember seeing it, but
An ATM camera snaps still images onto videotape at preset intervals. The camera at the mall where Ocker disappeared took a picture every 10 seconds. Lori Ocker had been missing 5 days by the time investigators were able to obtain the tape. The image, fuzzy but undeniable, was Ocker's car. Next to it was a figure, assumed to be Ocker. It was the next image, taken 10 seconds later, that caught investigators' attention.
The picture was not clear. The focus of the camera was on a person who was negotiating a transaction with the machine. Over his shoulder, deeper into the parking lot, was what we believe a scene of abduction.
The image showed a car crossing the victim's path. She's leaning into the car. In the next frame, the car is driving away and Lori is gone. The car, though ghost-like, vaguely resembled the Chevy owned by Robert Auker's mother. Robert Auker was a suspect by virtue of the fact that he and Lori parted on such hostile terms. Lori feared for her life, but it appeared that Robert had managed to lure her into the car.
At the time of this abduction, Robert Auker was exercising his first weekend of visitation, and he had in his custody the child. We absolutely have no statements to that effect, but circumstantially, we know that how devoted she was to that child. Is there any conceivable reason she would have gone into the car? Probably. If somebody would have told her that something was wrong with her child or she was needed, she might do it for that reason.
Investigators faced two obstacles linking the car to the homicide. First, the image on the ATM was too blurry to conclusively prove it was the Chevrolet. And second, Robert Auker's father had sold the car 3 days after Lori Auker disappeared. It had changed hands 4 times in the month since Auker sold it. It was finally traced to its new owner, 90 miles away. Despite the fact that the car had been thoroughly cleaned prior to sale, the forensics team was able to raise clues from the vehicle. In a door gasket were strands of hair consistent with the victim's. It had pulp on the end, indicating that it didn't just fall out.
The question was, why would Lori Auker's hair be there in a car not belonging to Robert Auker, but belonging to the mother? We also had information that she seldom, if ever, was near that vehicle.
Gentlemen.
Hello, Kurt.
Clue by clue, the circumstantial evidence was building against Robert Auker.
The rear light configuration, this is a much...
But investigators knew that the case depended on identifying the vehicle on the tape.
Without any witnesses, our main witness in the case was the camera itself. Murder is not a spectator sport. You seldom get eyewitnesses to a murder.
Right.
Investigators
tried the next best thing.
The original.
They reconstructed the crime using the Auker's Chevy.
Have any other ATM photographs that we're going to use?
They positioned it in the parking lot to approximate the unknown car, and they taped it with the same camera and focus as the ATM image. Then, the two images were compared. The results were encouraging, but inadequate to snuff reasonable doubt. The tape from the ATM wasn't enough. Investigators knew they needed to enhance the image, but in 1989, enhancement technology was in its infancy. They didn't know if it was possible to clean up the video. Sakavage contacted Eastman Kodak for help. They suggested NASA. If anyone on the planet had the ability to turn fuzzy images into hard evidence, it would be the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization at Kennedy Space Center. Principal investigator Alan Tietjen is in charge of analyzing images from shuttle launches for evaluation or troubleshooting. When the Pennsylvania State Police contacted him, he knew that enhancing the ATM tape wasn't rocket science, but it was close.
The process was very much the same. The source material was different in that videotape from a ATM machine is poorer quality than what we normally deal with.
Tietjen knew the quality of the image was too poor to identify faces or the license plate. The best he could hope for was to identify the car model. The image was loaded into a computer, which converted it into a digital image made of dots of light called pixels. 512 pixels per line, 512 lines per image. The process took 5 days. The computer, governed by a set of mathematical equations, manipulates the pixels, enhancing the picture.
There is no human intervention directing a specific result. The mathematics determine the result.
Each set of equations produces a different outcome. Tietjen had to be meticulous in his methods. He was setting a precedent. Never before had video enhancement been used in a capital case. He devoted 3 weeks to enhancing the ATM video. Once he completed it, he set to work enhancing the police reconstruction video. He used the same parameters for both in order to demonstrate that the images were in fact enhanced and not altered.
We also
Even with enhancement, the car in the original video wasn't perfectly clear. To make their case, investigators hired an expert from General Motors to identify the make and model of the car. He identified it as a Chevy Celebrity, model year 1983 or 84. Robert Auker's mother drove a 1984 model. Sakavich had placed the Auker's car and Robert Auker at the crime scene. The image enhancement made his case. Based on the forensic evidence and the unambiguously enhanced images, Robert Auker was sentenced to death for the kidnapping and murder of his estranged wife, Lori Auker. The landmark case also established image enhancement as a powerful tool in the crime fighter's arsenal.
There are video cameras all around us. So they're capturing images, and whenever anything significant happens, now police are going to those cameras to try and capture some critical evidence, and now they're using digital imaging to try and get it enhanced to a point where it's more reliable than it would have otherwise been.
Every murder investigation is like a puzzle. Solving it requires finding the right pieces. But in a case in the Philippines, investigators had the pieces they needed. They just didn't know how to fit them together. In the pre-dawn hours of February 25, 1991, a disabled truck on a desolate road caught the eye of a taxi driver in Angeles City, the Philippines. He stopped to assist the driver. He realized he had no help to offer. The woman behind the wheel was dead. When police arrived, the key was still in the ignition. The driver was still strapped into her seat. She was an American. Officials at nearby Clark Air Base were notified.
Calling Central, this is Chief Gindon. Pwedeng pakidala dito ng mga pulis para ma-check natin itong babae nito mukhang at Clark Air Base.
Life on the base is tight-knit. The first investigator on the scene thought he recognized the truck and its driver, a Master Sergeant's wife named Julie Snodgrass.
Tim Davis.
Office of Special Investigations Regional Forensic Consultant Lieutenant Colonel Tim Davis was summoned.
As we approached the truck, one of the agents came over and said, "Sir, I think it's Julie." When I walked up to the truck and looked in, I just said, "Oh my God!" And you don't forget those kind of things. I will tell you that. You just don't.
As an Air Force wife, Julie was a friendly face at picnics and parties, which she attended with her husband, Joe, and sometimes their 2 young children.
She was a good gal to be around, friendly, never knew an enemy. That's what I had a problem with when I was at the scene, was that I'd just seen Julie 2 days before, and I'd ask her, hey, I told her she looked great. She's got this great glow in her eyes, this great smile, and it's tough.
The glove box had been ransacked. Its contents spilled across the seat and onto the floor. Superficially, it looked like a robbery, but it was too violent for that. The victim had been stabbed more than 40 times.
This was an act of violence. This wasn't an act of, hey lady, give me your purse. I'm going to steal your truck. It wasn't anything like that. This was an act that was done clearly to kill Julie.
The truck was carefully transported to a garage at the base where it was swabbed for blood that might belong to the killer. Hair and fibers were also collected. The sample were sent to the Army Crime Lab at Camp Zama, Japan. The results were disappointing. None of the blood, fibers, or hair found in the car pointed to anyone other than the victim. Investigators hoped that more significant clues were still to be found. The truck was carefully enclosed in a tent and fumed with superglue vapor, which exposes latent fingerprints. Some partial prints were lifted from the dashboard. They didn't belong to Julie or Joe Snodgrass, but the Philippines had no system to match fingerprints with known felons. It was another dead end. Besides the brutality of the crime, one question kept nagging at Davis. What was the victim doing in that part of town, especially at that hour?
If Julie went somewhere, generally it was on base only. Very rarely did Julie ever go off base.
The victim's husband, Joe Snodgrass, was questioned about the night of the murder. It was an awkward situation. Joe was in charge of managing all the evidence collected from crimes involving Air Force personnel in the Philippines. Because of his personal connection, the murder of his wife was one case he was not cataloging.
Joe, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. Where were you?
Snodgrass told investigators that he and Julie argued. She stormed out.
Well, that day I was out
He called
shopping
several
with
of
my
her
wife,
friends to see if they'd seen or heard from
we had
her.
a fight, and,
He
we
even
pretty
kept a
much fought
log
our
of the
man
calls
for the
he'd
day,
made.
so around 10:30 she just left.
That level of attention to
So I
detail
just
raised
came back to the base.
suspicions.
If you're watching and you believe in the TV cop stuff, primarily one of the things that a guilty person does is keep a log of the phone calls. So you just think, oh, come on, this is too obvious here. but he actually did.
Joe and Julie Snodgrass had a history of domestic problems. In fact, a year earlier, Julie had divorced Joe and moved back to the States with their children. Joe had convinced her to come back to him 1 month before her death.
Okay, what kind of job do you do?
To see if their relationship was souring once again, investigators spoke to their housekeeper.
And I take care of the children.
She was nervous and unable to offer any information about the Snodgrasses' relationship.
Where you at?
Considering her daily interactions with the family, that seemed strange. Investigators had no evidence to justify their suspicions about Joe Snodgrass. Then, the housekeeper decided to come clean.
So, Lucy, what did you do?
Just as the investigation into the murder of Julie Snodgrass was hitting a wall, the timid young housekeeper broke the case open.
What did you do with the letter?
She admitted to having an affair with Joe Snodgrass. More than that, she told investigators that he had written her a letter asking her to hire her relatives to kill Julie Snodgrass.
He asked me to find somebody to kill her. He wanted me to find.
She destroyed it. but her word was enough to get a warrant to search Joe's office.
Did you get to find your relative? What?
Investigators confiscated some handwritten letters and computer floppy disks from his office.
Yeah. We'll keep looking back here.
Okay.
Then, as a matter of legal procedure, Snodgrass was called in to identify the items collected in order to establish ownership.
Nothing? What's that?
When presented with the floppy disks, Snodgrass suddenly lunged forward and pulled something out of his pocket.
We heard one of the agents call out he has a weapon, and at that time a number of agents who were armed ran by us and ran to the interview room, and then it was determined at that point that Joe had a pair of scissors.
Snodgrass had concealed a pair of pinking shears.
He had grabbed the disc all in basically one motion. This was like flash second stuff, and Joe began to cut the disc up into pieces. This is evidence. This is not supposed to happen, but it did.
Look at this.
The disks obviously contained something incriminating.
That stuff.
Could their data be salvaged? Davis wasn't hopeful.
I mean, you've taken something that was intact and now it's in 20-some pieces, and in your mind, it's there in a sense becomes 23 more pieces of evidence. How do you deal with it?
That was the question of the hour. No one had ever dealt with anything quite like it before. He sent the fragments to the Department of Defense Computer Forensics Laboratory in Washington, D.C. They became the responsibility of Special Agent Jim Christie of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations.
From the time I got the initial phone call from the Philippines, we had all our computer crime investigators out trying to find someone who had a technique to recover the data, because no one had ever tried that before. You're gonna like this.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Those discs from the Philippines.
Not only were the discs cut up, each piece was crumpled as well.
Cool. No problem.
Christie shopped the discs to private companies, to other law enforcement agencies, to the FBI. Each politely declined, saying the task was impossible or staggeringly expensive.
So when my deputy, Ed Cutchins, and we drove around the Beltway, picked up our discs, and we're driving back around the Beltway and coming back to the headquarters here, and Ed said, okay, you've let everybody else have a shot at this, you're going to let me have a shot. And I said, what are you going to do? He says, well, I'm going to Scotch tape them back together. And I won't tell you what I told him at that point.
They experimented with blank, formatted discs, cutting them, taping them back together, and slipping them into a drive to see if the data were still readable. The first attempt was disappointing.
So we turned it on, and I watched my disk drive bounce across the table for about 10-15 seconds till the read-write heads ripped off.
Before they tried again, investigators placed a second floppy underneath the taped floppy to cover up the seams. They saw their first glimmer of progress. The disk drive survived. But before they could apply the technique to the actual disk fragments, they had to flatten them out. Once again, brainstorming and intensive trial and error brought results. A soldering iron placed in a section of aluminum tubing provided the right amount of heat and pressure to flatten the fragile sheet. Once the segments were flattened, investigators had to try to read them. They knew they might only have one chance, so when putting the pieces together, they erred on the side of caution.
We were afraid that if we put them all together, that if one piece ripped and caught the head, it might tear up the other evidence. So we decided to create host diskettes, what we called host diskettes for each piece.
Each fragment was spliced onto its own separate host diskette and read individually. 23 fragments, 23 host diskettes. one chance to catch a killer. Computer forensics experts in Washington, D.C. puzzled over how to assemble the pieces of the mutilated diskettes in order to solve a murder. Some of the fragments were so small, investigators didn't know how to align them on the disk. These more troublesome pieces were sprayed with a solution called Magna-C. The magnetic spray dries to a powder and reveals the magnetic tracks on the disk fragments. Once the fragment was properly aligned on the host diskette, the powder was brushed away. Finally, came time to read the fragments. To analyze and display the bits and pieces of data, investigators relied on a software package called AnaDisk, developed for law enforcement. AnaDisk kept a trail of the separate segments of data and displayed them on the screen so they could be combined. The pieces, in more ways than one, were falling into place. But the splices still caused problems. Information on a diskette is tightly packed. Whenever the disk drive head hit a splice, it lost contact with the disk and missed large chunks of data. For this high-tech problem, an assistant supplied a low-tech solution.
Well, what he did was he just put his finger on the head, just like you would put a penny or a coin on an old photograph if you got stuck. And by putting his finger on it and rereading that sector, the head didn't bounce and we were able to get more data.
Investigators found love letters Snodgrass wrote to his wife and to his mistress, along with letters to his insurance company requesting an increase in Julie Snodgrass's coverage. They also recovered information linking Joe to an elaborate black market scheme. But what they found next was akin to a signed confession.
We found a last paragraph of a letter talking about his girlfriend hiring the hitman, him asking his girlfriend to hire hitmen, which she did.
It had taken 5 weeks, but the DoD forensics lab had achieved what was thought to be impossible. They had resurrected data that enabled a brutal murder to be avenged, and in the process developed a set of procedures for others to follow. Experts said the cost could reach into the millions. They spent $131. The information they gathered was sent back to Lieutenant Colonel Davis in the Philippines.
For me? Great. I'll tell you flat out, had we probably not had that, we'd have had a tougher case to prove. But with the documentation that was recovered from that disc, there was no mistake. We had Joe.
Investigators reconstructed the likely course of events that led up to the murder. Joe Snodgrass, who was very controlling of his wife, had convinced her to deliver some money he owed to one of his black market contacts. He told her to pick up 2 of his Confederates and to drive them to the drop-off point. She complied. She didn't know that the men she picked up were the ones hired to murder her. They were the relatives of the Snodgrass's housekeeper. Trusting them, she drove to a secluded spot. Then they killed her.
Felix, can you tell us what happened that night?
I didn't, sorry, sir.
They confessed to the crime and received 20 years. The housekeeper received probation.
I'll do it this last time, but not anymore.
And for masterminding the crime, Joe Snodgrass received life in prison.
You never stop and think that you would end up investigating one of your own for murder or being involved in the conspiracy to commit murder. It never crosses your mind, not once.
The technology that simplifies our lives has also made it harder for us to pass unnoticed. In almost everything we do, we leave behind an electronic trail as solid as footprints and as individual as our own face. When a crime occurs unseen by human eyes, investigators can invoke an electronic witness.